can now bring in Oliver McTernan, Director at Forward Thinking, an NGO working to promote an inclusive peace process in the Middle East. Thank you very much for joining us here on France 24 today. If you heard there from our reporter, she said now that Benjamin Netanyahu has these two hostages that have been released, he basically has proof to tell the United States and other countries that are concerned about his offensive in Rafah that this is the way to secure the release of the remaining hostages.
Well, I'm afraid I would profoundly disagree with that. They struck lucky, and thankfully for the families concerned, it was great to see that reunion of the families with their released hostages. But the price, the human price of this exercise, I think is far, far too great. How many bereaved, grieving families are there in Gaza as a price for this release? And I think that's what Netanyahu is gambling with. The consequences of the way he is doing this thing will live on well after him. And that would be my deep concern. His goals of the demise of Hamas, the destruction of Hamas, and the release of the hostages remain incompatible.
We have seen over 28,000 Palestinians killed in Gaza. Yes, some of them are Hamas fighters, quite a lot of them. We don't have the exact numbers. Let's talk about something that has been taking place in recent days, and that's, of course, the growing frustration and apparent rift between the United States and Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Apparently, Joe Biden has been frustrated, according to close aides. But the United States has a lot of leverage over the state of Israel. Why doesn't Biden use it?
I think that's a very, very good question. And it's the question I think people, even in his administration, more and more of them are asking. Because on the one hand, we hear Biden saying, I endorse your goals, the destruction of Hamas. And on the other hand, he's saying, we'll save the people. I don't know what he's watching or what reports he's receiving, but it's very clear to anyone who has ears to hear and eyes to see that what we are facing in Gaza currently is a humanitarian catastrophe. What he's asking now is take care of people who are already suffering from 2.3 million on the whole, suffering from life-changing circumstances. What Biden should be clearly saying to Netanyahu, and for the sake of Israel and its future security, enough is enough. Stop it now. This has to have a negotiated way out of it, not a military way out of it.
I want to ask you about the potential for a negotiated settlement, because last week we had the U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken in the region for his fifth trip since this conflict broke out. And Netanyahu basically shot dead any prospect of a negotiated settlement with Hamas. Netanyahu says there's simply no way he can give in to any of their demands. So where does that leave a negotiated settlement?
Well, what we're dealing with is someone who needs this war to continue in order to secure his position in government. Now, that needs to be recognized because it's very difficult to see how he can be objective, how he can actually put the interests of his country, the security of his country long term in the picture if his own political survival depends on this war continuing. Now, I think what's needed, again, as I would say, is direct intervention. And there's only one country, sadly, that matters here in our present global order, and that's the United States. Biden can't be saying to Netanyahu, please be careful, and at the same time giving the bombs, supplying the weapons and the political support that's enabling him to continue this. One of the points I think we should point out with the hostage situation, all along it's been said that for negotiations to succeed and to secure the safe release of the remaining hostages, a ceasefire was necessary. Now, last night's operation showed that contrary to what Netanyahu has been saying all along, the hostages are held together. We get them at Shifa Hospital. Now we'll get them in Khan Yunis. Now we go to Rafah. We've seen from last night, actually, the hostages are probably being held all over the place. So to bring them together, to coordinate a proper exchange, you do need a ceasefire.
Indeed, and also hostages. He's been saying all along are probably underground, and now they were found in a two-story building. Another thing that the Israeli Prime Minister has been saying is that he opposes a Palestinian state. This is obviously a statement that flies in the face of what the United States and the international community wants. Yet somehow Biden continues to let Israel do what it's doing.
Sadly, I think if you look at the history, and we're reaching back 75 years, you might say, there has been no real effort by the international community to say, abide by the UN Charter, the UN declarations on this issue. There's been no real attempt to implement. Oslo was a disaster because it was a top-down solution. It was an imposed solution on the Palestinian people. What are we seeing now? Exactly the same thing going on. People talking about the day after, who should rule Gaza, instead of them saying what we need now is a defining moment when we really address the Palestinian situation. They're given an independent, sovereign state, despite of what Netanyahu thinks. That's what the international community, led by Biden, needs to be saying at present.
Earlier today, we had Netanyahu who said continued military pressure will free hostages, but it could also put their lives at risk, can't it? Does the Prime Minister care about the fate of the hostages, or is it all about staying in power?
Well, it's very difficult to get into Netanyahu's mind. But one of the people I've been speaking recently to was a senior Israeli negotiator, and he would share my concerns that this present policy is not putting the safety of the hostages first. It's very high risk. You may rescue two, but how many more people are going to die? And how many more people die in the bombing? How many more are the hostages? We get the casualties from the Palestinian side, but we just do not know how many of those hostages are alive, purely from the level of bombing. And so as long as this continues, I think we're not only seeing jeopardy for the 2.3 million, I keep stressing, living in Gaza in horrendous conditions, but we're also seeing the lives of the 100+ Israeli hostages really put at risk, high risk.
Indeed. Oliver McTernan, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us on the program today.
Thank you.